Okay, so in the earlier part of this video, I had outlined basically the structure of GDP. Talked about the fact that consumption represents about 70% of it, and that it has basically three very large categories. Those three large categories being durable goods, non-durable goods, and services, with services being the largest. Now, in terms of investment, what we're talking about with investment, let's be very clear here. We're not talking about like stocks or bonds or things like that. What we're really talking about here are capital goods. Goods that are, machines, buildings, things that are being used to produce other stuff over a long period of time. It can also represent a very durable good, basically. We have one component being the residential fixed investment. Residential fixed investment, that's basically housing. So housing, residential housing, if I buy a house, it is part of the investment component of the GDP. And then there is the business fixed investment. Business fixed investment would be then a firm buying a warehouse or buying a machine, an assembly line. And then the third major component of investment, and this one's very important, is inventories. Inventories are when a firm basically produces more than is being sold, so they store it for a period of time. Now, it turns out, what's interesting is that that inventory component is actually the most volatile component of the GDP. In fact, for Keynesians, Keynesians believe that the entire business cycle is actually caused by fluctuations in that inventory. So that was the Keynesian explanation of business cycles, was the changing levels of inventories, something that we're going to look at in a bit here. Okay, we also then have government expenditures. So an important point about the government expenditures is that it's not for like welfare payments or things like that. What we're really talking about here is the government actually buying a good or service. So if the government gives me, let's say, $200 to go out and buy health insurance, that's not considered the government buying a good or service. But if I'm poor and I go on Medicaid, right, that would be health care for the poor, the government's actually buying my health care for me, right? And so that would then be a government expenditure. Just as the computer I'm talking to you on is owned by you, the taxpayers of Wisconsin, right? So this would be one of your capital goods taxpayers have purchased. Same with this building and everything else. It's important to note as well that something like Social Security is not part of the GDP. It is merely a transfer payment. The government isn't buying anything when it pays Social Security, as opposed to Medicare, where the government's actually buying health care for the elderly. Two very different programs in the ways in which they're counted as part of the GDP. I should say that, so whereas this is about 70%, this is a little bit less than 20%. This is a little bit greater than 20% now, after you include like state and local governments to the federal government. And then finally, net exports. Net exports actually turns out in the case of the U.S. to be a negative number. And it's a negative number because we import more than we export. In fact, it's about negative 6% here. So again, exports would be what we sell to the rest of the world. We are the world's largest supplier of airplanes, for instance. We sell a lot of them. We also sell a lot of legal services. We're really good at accounting, right? We export these goods and services to the rest of the world. Obviously, we buy a lot of goods, though, from other countries. And we buy more than we export to the rest of the world. Hence the reason why it's a negative number. Okay, so one thing I've been trying to focus on here as well is that the GDP doesn't cover everything. So we've obviously looked at one thing it's not counting are government transfer payments. If the government just pays you money for something, that's not considered part of the GDP. But it also doesn't include things like non-market goods and services. So if I sell, well, for instance, I live alone in an apartment, right? And so I have to do my own dishes, I have to clean my cat's litter, I have to, vacuum my own apartment. Well, that's not part of the GDP, right? Now, if I worked for a company like Tom's Cleaning Service, right, then that would be part of GDP, right? Or when I watch my niece, I babysit my niece, that's a non-market good or service, right? But if I had a babysitting club, I guess, or company, right, that would be part of the GDP. Now, this is actually a pretty sizable amount, and in fact, feminist economists have actually pointed out that that the GDP then tends to usually underestimate actual production in the economy because it doesn't include what's done within the household. And the reason why feminist economists brought it up is that back in the 70s, that would have been much more so where women would have been located in an economic sphere, right, would have been in the household. Now, that's a little bit less so the case, but actually, if you're interested in that kind of thing, actually the studies still show, though, that women actually still put in more like cleaning time and house time than men do. It also, the GDP doesn't cover illegal goods and services. So, right, something like, if I had, like if I sold like marijuana on the street, right? Obviously, marijuana would be illegal in Wisconsin, right? So, as an illegal activity, right, my activities don't increase the GDP. Now, if I moved to California, though, right, and I was selling it for medicinal purposes, then it would become legal, right? Just as in the case of the Netherlands, right, where it is part of GDP because it is a legal activity, versus the United States as a whole, where it's not, right? And it's not just limited to that, right? Like, what if I sold bootleg DVDs, right? Obviously, that's an activity, that does have some economic component, right? I sell DVDs from my office for, let's say, $2 a pop, right? That's certainly something that I'm doing that's an economic activity, but because it's illegal, it's not going to be counted. Other things not counted would be leisure, right? If I go home and go to sleep, obviously I get some joy out of just being able to sleep in, but that's not going to increase the GDP. Financial transactions, right? If I buy a $10,000 bond, that's not part of GDP, but there's typically a service fee I would have to pay to the broker to buy such a thing. That would be part of the GDP. Finally, then, one of the other big components would be used goods are not considered part of GDP. So I actually sell about once a month something on eBay. Now, when I sell something on eBay, right, I am paying certain fees to eBay to list the item. That is part of GDP. But the actual thing I'm selling, right, if it's say I'm selling a pair of shoes right now for $100. And I think they're going to sell, fingers crossed. And if they do sell, right, I paid, I think, $1 and some change to eBay to list the item and to actually sell it. And I'll have to pay some postage, too, to send it out. But the $100, not part of GDP, right? So, the GDP will most of the time tend to underestimate the actual production in the economy. And that'll become important because when we're looking at these three statistics of prices, production, and unemployment, it's important to know how they're flawed. In this case, GDP tends to underestimate it. Okay, I'm going to stop the video here, and then we're going to pick it up with prices and unemployment.